Secretary Ash Carter. As you all know, Ash was Secretary of Defense for President Obama. Ash, like the members of the last panel, is a hybrid person. Ash has a PhD in physics, and then a long career at Harvard Kennedy School as an academic, long career in government. We served together in the Bill Clinton administration, working on Russia and Ukraine together in the mid-1990s.
Embarrassed to say, Nick, I first worked for Caspar Weinberger.
He first worked for Caspar. We need a working mic.
I think I've got it.
First worked for Caspar Weinberger. Long career in government. Now back, we sit about 20 feet from each other, on one corner at Harvard Kennedy School. Ash is a member of our group. He came to the conference and gave the first foundational lecture. We call it the Ernest May Memorial Lecture. Ernest May was an eminent professor at Harvard. He was an historian of American diplomacy, of international politics. He used to come to our meetings when I first joined the Aspen Strategy Group. He would always give us the comprehensive framework lecture as we started. How should we think about this problem from an historical perspective? Ash gave the lecture, which is the first chapter of the book that you're all going to buy, which is right here. And Ash, I wanted to start by asking you to maybe explain that lecture, the points you were trying to make, which is how have we negotiated this transition, the various transitions in 70 years as a science and technology power? And welcome.
Thanks, Nick. It's good to see everyone here. I'm not in Washington very often and already saw a number of friends. Nick, I thank and commend you, Joe, Condi, for making technology the theme at Aspen this summer. And that's not only because I'm a physicist and that's what I'm doing now at Harvard and also MIT, but because it is the subject of the day. When I walked out of the Pentagon after 37 years from the day I walked in, almost literally to the day I walked in, 2 years and whatever, 5 days ago, I said to myself, I care very much about defending our country, making a better world for our children. I've done that. What's the next crusade for me personally? And to me, it is dealing with the dilemmas that technological change continues to throw up for human life. You see that in the digital world in spades in a number of ways, which I'm sure we'll discuss. And I just heard Doug Beck talking about, I'm sure others as well. If you think that is a mixed bag, and it is, and one of the things I wanted to say at Aspen was how we can do better in dealing with these digital dilemmas of social media or artificial intelligence and so forth. If you think that's a mixed bag, think about the bio revolution which is to come. And then there is the issue of jobs and training, and the fact that if too many of our citizens feel that technology is something which is zipping by them with heedless disregard for their own welfare, we're not going to have a cohesive society. And so in those three areas, digital, bio, and jobs and training, I tried to go back in time a little bit, the way Ernest May would have, and say, what can we learn a little bit from history? Let me tell you a little piece of that, first of all, which touches me personally. I am a physicist, and the people who brought me up in physics were the Manhattan Project generation. And they were my mentors and tutors. And they had done something, they had invented what we would call today a disruptive technology, the bomb. And they were proud of that because it had ended World War II and it had kept the peace for 50 dark years and dangerous years of Cold War. But they also realized that with it came an existential danger to humanity. And they gave themselves, and this is Richard Garwin, Edward Teller, Sidney Drell, Hans Bethe, these were the people. And in the various ways and in various politics and so forth, they all devoted themselves to arms control, nonproliferation, missile defense, civil defense. That is, to using their inventive minds to soften the impact. And what they were telling people like me, and that's how I got into defense in the first place, is that with knowledge comes responsibility. And I gave a little try to defense early on, just as a part-time thing, in very much the way Doug Beck was talking about. And that's what one of the things I tried to replicate as Secretary of Defense. Let people give it a try, because I found that in my own life, that the combination of having a little bit of expertise so that what you knew actually mattered to something, the other part of consequence, was a magical combination for a young person. And I think that's true today. I see it every day. And if they feel that spark and ultimately that weight, I think we can do a lot better. So that was the generation I came into. There was a generation that came after my Nick, which very much informed the digital revolution, which was different, which was more libertarian. And I respect that. It was a different generation and a different time. And the belief was that good things would come through openness and freedom and liberty, and that was the spirit in which the internet grew up, and that was a good thing, and I participated in that, same as everybody else. But I think we underestimated the dark side. And now it's a great thing, and it enables commerce and community, but also hate and darkness and aggression and so forth.
Russian intervention.
At Russia, China, I mean, let me keep going.
Yeah. North Korea, Iran.
North Korea, Iran, there's the big four, not to mention all the terrorists. And then there's a little strategy for you right there on one hand. And I think there's a lot we can do about those things. And can I give you one little example? I'll give you one little example that comes from watching the hearings, let's say the Mark Zuckerberg hearings on the Hill or subsequent tech leaders. And my impression of those is that they were a huge missed opportunity. It was an historic moment where, had both sides been better prepared and better inclined, we could have made an advance on this nagging problem on our civilization. And the leaders, industry leaders, for their part, I think kind of, the way I'd put it, is got through the news cycle, but aren't going to get through the arc of history with that story. And the members, I only wish, Nick, that they had been as poorly prepared to question me about war and peace and you in your day as they had been to ask questions. But imagine something different. Imagine where everybody had gone in, because the subtext of the whole thing was that some mixture of self-regulation by companies and informed regulation by government, either antitrust or some other kind, was needed. Everybody was kind of saying that, but there was no architecture out there. Was that a 20-80 mix, an 80-20 mix? What are the options? And that they could be debated, but there wasn't even anything on the table. And the example I want to give you of a time when it was better, and Nick, was a little something I saw long ago that I think could be something like it could be rebuilt on the congressional side. And it was this. My first thing ever was those same people I talked to said, hey, Ash, the thing that you've got to go to Washington for 1 year and do is this. This is going to sound like old ancient history to you, but it was what to do with the MX missile. The MX missile was a 10-warhead ICBM, peak of the Cold War, height of the Cold War. Soviets were building. We felt we needed to match. we built this missile, and then the question was, what do you do with a big missile that will allow it to survive the onslaught of a Soviet first strike? That being a necessary consideration, and Nick, as a participant in many of those arms control negotiations, you know the lore. You don't want to have vulnerable weapons because vulnerable weapons are a danger to both sides because the owner of them has to use them, and the beholder of that knows that they better go first, or and so forth. And so it's not a good thing. So what to do with the, and they said, it's an important problem. You got to go to Washington, or it's a technical problem. You got to work on it. And I went and I worked on that for a year, but never mind that. The process was kind of interesting. There was an organization, it was called the Office of Technology Assessment at the time, never mind that place or that thing, but it had a mechanism, which was this. It had a bipartisan, bicameral board that decided what it would work on, first ingredient. Second, it appointed over us, a few physicists, a bunch of senior retired people, senior officials, senior military officers, retired congressmen and senators, people from the states that would be essentially paved over to do what we were going to do at the time, our first option. And then we went out and looked at all the options, and I mean all the options, moving them around on planes, trucks, trains, burying them. One of the options I looked at was a 14 million foot airship. Would have been the largest airship since the Graf Zeppelin, which would fly around with this missile hanging. I mean, imagine that. Crowd pleaser.
It was never built.
And no. But the point was that we looked at all the options and gave a respectful hearing, even to things that were kind of fringy like that. And then the last thing is that we talked to every stakeholder in industry, in the states, every member, every industry group, every lobbyist, every member, and so that everybody could say they were heard. Those were 4 pretty good ingredients to giving Congress. I'd like to see something like that start, and then I think we can begin to climb on top of these things, whether they be digital, Nick, or whether they be biology, or whether they be jobs and training. Those are the 3 baskets. We got to get to solutions, or we're going to be in trouble.
So when Tom Donilon was on this stage before you, Ash, about an hour ago, he said, bring back that office.
Oh, okay. That or something like it.
As part of his action plan. So, Ash, part of what we've been talking today, and in the book, and in your lecture that you gave last August, first chapter of our book, the relationship, sometimes quite troubled, between the federal government, the Pentagon, the Congress, and the tech community. One of your innovations, you thought about this a lot as Secretary of Defense, was I'm going to send people out. I'm going to establish DoD offices in Silicon Valley, in our hometown, Boston, Cambridge, Massachusetts, in Austin, Texas, and we're going to learn from each other.
I would have done more also over time.
Was it successful? What would you advise Acting Secretary Shanahan to do now with those offices? Was it sufficient? Was it ambitious enough? I mean, how do you account for it?
I think it's worked out well, and I'll tell you why I think that. But it's not sufficient. It was one piece of a broader mosaic. I didn't know at the time. That's why I called it DIUX, experimental. I said, and actually
Defense Innovation
Unit experimental.
Experimental.
And Jim, my successor, Jim Mattis, I've known for 25 years. Jim, to his credit, or maybe to the credit of the idea and the people like Doug Becker who were working on it, it earned taking the X away. But it didn't look like that way at first. In fact, we stumbled in a few ways at first, and it's a few things that didn't work, and we had to start over again, and we were trying to meet the Valley or Boston or Austin. I would have done Dayton and a few others, halfway. These are people who, like me, when I started out, when I did that MX thing, I didn't want to be in government. I wanted to stay doing what I was doing, which was physics. I was happy to give it a try, but I didn't want to live in Washington. Now it turns out it stuck more to me than it will to most people, but that's okay. And that means meeting people both ways. And this was the time when we had Edward Snowden as an overhang, and you can imagine what I think of Edward Snowden. But you had to agree to disagree about certain things in order to reach a point where, and you could say to someone, come on and give it a try. Overwhelmingly, even skeptical. And I had people in the Pentagon, I led in the Defense Digital Service, who had their hoodies on, their aviator glasses on their head, their earrings, and it was a little bit difficult for those of us who look like this or have a uniform on. And so we had to be flexible in the interests of building this bridge. So it takes a little flexibility on both sides. But that, the digital service and so forth, and at the same time, remember, we spend $80 billion a year, which is more than all the big tech companies combined. And at the same time, we needed to do, and that was being mentioned, I think, by Chris in the last, well, everybody in the last panel, making that transition, that great transition that we're still embarked on from the era of counterterrorism and counterinsurgency, which we so focused on. And I'm as guilty as anyone. I mean, when I was Undersecretary for Acquisition Technology and Logistics, and it was 2010, and we were surging into Afghanistan, you bet your life that was a preoccupation. You got people fighting, you're all in for them. And I was all in for them. And I was spending as much time buying MRAPs and dogs, sniffing dogs, as I was F-35s and stuff like that. And yes, it was attractive, but now we got to get back to the main game here, which is China, Russia, and so forth. And we spent too long backing off of that agenda. I'm glad to see us back in there. I was doing that myself and would have continued, and I'm glad to see it continuing under Jim Mattis and now the acting secretary, Pat Shanahan.
Thank you, Ash. So we're going to open this up to questions, but before we do, one of the predominant questions today, but also throughout this book, two big questions. General Dunford, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, that you know exceptionally well, Eric Lander, someone else you know well, have both said, from a military and scientific point of view, we risk losing our primacy. Eric Lander, as the leading science and technology country in the world because of the breakdown of the innovation triangle. General Dunford, the speed with which AI, machine learning, quantum computing, biotech revolutions are proceeding means that our current platform systems could be obsolete in the generation ahead, and we could lose the race for military superiority. That's everything to us, for those of us who think about American foreign and defense policy. Do you agree? I mean, are you ringing the village bell as loud as they are?
Absolutely, I agree. Look, we're great. We're inventive. We're powerful. We've got a great legacy. We got a great installed base. But this is a competitive world, and nobody has a birthright. And these guys, our enemies, are hungry, and they're focused on us. We may say we have Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, terrorism, cricket, as I used to call them, and we do. But they all have just us. They're all looking just at us. So it's not a birthright, Nick. And that preoccupation I talked about was a distraction in some ways, and we pay a little price in that. I don't know how you measure it in years. We got to get that back. And I'm not pessimistic about this, but I think it's something we have to work at. You can't take it for granted. They're out for us.
When you sat with President Obama and the national security team, but really your relationship with him, was this something that really drove him? Did he recognize it and wanted to mobilize the U.S. government around it?
Yeah, I mean, it did. Remember, President Obama was somebody who was not a technologist himself, but both generationally and by intellectual inclination, sort of technologically interested. And he evidenced that in many ways. So he followed defense stuff, sometimes to the dismay of his department, closely, some technology things. But yeah, he was interested. in it, and I think was also making that transition in the. I'm glad to see it going, and I'm not one of these people who believes that the whole world changes in every change of administration, even in the current circumstances, unusual as this can be. And so that has been going on. It started then. I'm glad to see it continue. But I mean, we got to put our heads down. And the other thing that we didn't have back in the Soviet Union, Nick, and you know that because you as ambassador and so forth, and to NATO and that part of the world know very well. We had a long-standing competitive relationship with another major power, which was technologically potent. The Soviet Union was no joke, and they were a serious competitor. But we did not have an economic relationship with them. And so we have never had a sustained economic relationship with a communist dictatorship and controlled economy. And that's what China is. I mean, there's no nice way to say that. And in the case of the Soviet Union, we had an impermeable barrier between us and them. We did not trade with them. You remember the whole export control system and so forth. So it was a different kind of relationship. Now we are inextricably entwined with China economic. That makes it harder to create an enclave. And then on top of that, there's so much technology which is outside of government. In those days, well, anything that happened that mattered happened in America. And most of that happened under government bucks. Neither of those is no longer true. So you put those together, and the government's writ over technology doesn't run as widely as it once did. That and the fact that China has access substantially in real time to the same body of innovation as we have puts an extra burden on us to be better at incorporating that into our public protection.
Thank you very much. So in this year, we focus on one big issue a year. Democrats, Republicans, independents, nonpartisan. We're going to be in Aspen. We're going to focus on the U.S.-China relationship, and Ash has just been talking about that. And I think a lot of us feel, almost everybody feels, it's the most important challenge we face in the next half century. We're the two dominant societies. We're competing in a battle of ideas, authoritarianism versus a democratic system. We're competing this battle of technology, the race for the next generation of military technology. We're also going to have this year, for the first time, we will be sponsoring and running the Aspen Security Forum, which is the public Aspen program in the middle of July. For 4 days, we're going to have a national debate on many of these issues, and US-China, the technology battles, the ideological battles that Xi Jinping is fighting with us. That's going to be center stage too. And I can't think of anything more important that Americans should be doing in talking about these issues. And Ash is going to be a big part as one of our senior members of all of that. So questions for Ash Carter. Yes, please, and just please identify yourself, and a mic's going to come to you right now within 2.3 seconds. You can ask your question.
Yes, hello. Thank you for your discussion. Ina Barron, also Kennedy School student, 2003, Graham Allison, Ernest May was one of my professors as well. So my question is, considering that we cannot probably outspend Russia and China on defense, I'd like to ask is, what can we do to create the right level of overmatch on capabilities, S&T and E capabilities, that is also most affordable economically?
Thank you.
The key is science and technology, first of all. And so it is, I do think we, even as clumsy as we can be, and I'm embarrassed to say that as an institution, the Defense Department, still it is a pretty good imbiber of technology that's out there. And our tech sector is extremely vibrant. And so I'm not pessimistic at all about our ability to overmatch others, just to answer your question. Also, Nick, what you say is absolutely right. United States and China will be the big dogs, but we're not the only dogs around. And if you look at Asia, rather than China, China is kind of half of the Asian population and economics. I always say we don't have a China policy. We have an Asia policy. We always have. We've had one for, what, 80 years, Nick? And it has been the pivotal American military in the region which has kept the peace there. And that is appreciated by that other half. So in addition to being technologically excellent, in addition to spending still quite a lot of money on defense, and I was always grateful for it, and in addition to having spent that much more money than everybody else for a long time, which means our installed base is vast, in addition to being the most experienced military in the world, because we've been at war for 15 years, in addition to all that, we have all the friends and allies, and they have none. So that's a pretty powerful weight on our side, which, as I said, I'm not going to be complacent, but I'm not pessimistic either.
If I can just add to this, Ash and I have both spent a lot of time in government working on our relationship with India. I in the George W. Bush administration, Ash in the Obama administration.
Especially.
India, big science and technology country, big talent in the population, commitment to have a first-class Air Force and Navy. India is our security partner. Ash helped to build that relationship. Japan, Australia, South Korea, treaty allies. So it is, you can't just compare China and the United States. It's our alliance system, which has held the balance of power for, as you say, for 75 years. Questions? Yes, sir.
Mr. Secretary, I thought you might get a kick out of knowing that while you were working on the MX missile problem, a lot of us who are advocates, my name is Don Wilson, I work with foundations and nonprofits, we're also cutting our teeth on the MX missile. And until we met some of your folks who assured us that we had these things called submarines and we were going to be okay, that made us feel
They're pretty good too.
Yeah. One of the things that's been obviously, or the thing that's been an elephant in every room in any American policy discussion since 2016, of course, literally an elephant, is whether or not Russia successfully invaded and changed the election in 2016. And as you are one of our most distinguished diplomats, and you are one of the best defense secretaries we've had the luck of having, I wonder what you both think of that proposition and what you think we should do about it.
Well, sure they did. They obviously did. The evidence is overwhelming that they did. It's also obvious, I'll say this, that not enough has been done. I don't believe enough was done by the Obama administration, and not enough has been done by the, we haven't done enough. And in a more serious way, this gets us sort of far afield, but I'll just say one thing, which is an attack is an attack and deserves a response, even though this is kind of the in-betweeny sort of Russian hybrid warfare, little green men kind of version. It's aggression. And so they certainly tried to influence our politics, not just in the electoral sense, but just sometimes just stirring up gratuitous division. And they're doing it to this day. So that's what I would say, Nick.
And I would agree and just say this. Putin cannot, the Russian Federation cannot match the United States and our Canadian and European allies in Central and Western Europe in a conventional sense. They're contained. So what has he done? He's developed this hybrid strategy. It's intelligence operations. It's the use of cyber means to infiltrate social media. He attacked our electoral system and got into 23 of the databases of our state electoral systems, and he continues to do it. There is ample evidence that he tried to insinuate himself and his country into the Dutch, French, and German elections in 2017, and a lot of Brits think that they might have affected the Brexit vote in June of 2016. So it's continuing, and I would say that President Trump has been blind to admit it. He has not led on this issue. Congress has had to leave. Senator Burr and Senator Warner in their select committee. We need presidential leadership to raise the defenses and, as Ash just said, respond. because that's the language that Putin understands. Yes, sir, please.
Edward Luce from the Financial Times.
Welcome, Ed.
Hi, Nick. You've just been talking about Russia. I mean, I presume from a sort of larger picture in terms of America's interests, defending America's interests, you don't want to pursue a diplomacy in which Russia and China are driven together, a sort of reverse Nixon, reverse Kissinger. And yet that's kind of what's happening. And even if Trump weren't president, given what you've just been talking about, the level of justifiable concern about Russia's interference in America and other democracies, there's going to be antagonism towards Russia, understandable antagonism from any successor to Donald Trump. So China and Russia look destined to get closer and closer together, which is ominous for the United States and for the West. How would you prevent that from happening, or at least loosen that relationship if you were in charge?
I'll give it a stab, but then I think Nick probably has a better perspective on that than I do. They have a common interest in being antagonistic towards the United States. After that, they don't have much in the way of common interests. And, you know, we've spent 50, 60 years worried about a Chinese-Soviet condominium, and it kind of never happened. So I would say they share an interest in antagonizing the United States, and to the extent their efforts are complementary, we have to divide our assets and our attentions between the two of them. But they have so much else that is not going in the same direction. I won't even go through the checklist, but you know, China's going that way, Russia's going that way in so many ways. They share an uneasy Far East and an uneasy border and so forth. So they share us as a antagonist, but I would say it doesn't go much further than that. But Nick, you know much more about this than I do.
Not at all, but I'll just say I think it is a central question right now. There's no question that Xi Jinping and Putin are tactical allies, but tactical, not strategic. And what they want to do right now, the Chinese want to limit the power of Japan and India in the Indo-Pacific. The Russians want to limit the power of Germany, NATO, the EU, and the North Americans. And so they try to put roadblocks in front of us at the UN Security Council. And they both are using hybrid warfare to try to weaken democratic societies from within. So I think it's a considerable tactical problem. But strategically, Ash is undoubtedly right. But if you think about Russia, I think there are only something like 6 million Russians living east of the Ural Mountains, and there's 300 million Chinese just below them. China's going to dominate the Far East. You know this better than anybody. You've lived out there, you've written books about India. They're going to dominate the commerce and the strategy of the Far East. And I think Ash said something very important. We have always seen ourselves since Roosevelt and Truman's time as the guarantor of stability in East Asia. It's been the American military and the American Foreign Service together in Japan and the Korean Peninsula, in Australia, in Southeast Asia. We've been the guarantor of power. If we hold the position, the Chinese will have to deal with us. And the Russians will be a declining power by 2050, given demographics and given their unreformed carbon economy. So I actually think that while this is a tactical problem now for us, the strategic problem for our kids when they're succeeding Ash as Secretary of Defense is how do you both compete with the Chinese and hold your position, and that's going to be very competitive technologically, militarily, but how do you also partner with China? Because we need to work with the Chinese on climate change. It's a huge failing of the Trump administration not to recognize that we're the two largest carbon emitters. So Joe Nye, I thought, was very wise today when he led off his panel by saying we need to be in balance. Both political parties right now, ours, have turned towards unbridled competition with China. Yes, we have to compete. That's what this whole day has been about, but we have to work with the Chinese too. The Chinese will see us in a very different way than the Russians. They'll see us as a potential competitor, but also their partner. And I don't think the Russians figure into that equilibrium.
Can I just say something about that as well, just to further unrelieve the gloom? I worked with the Chinese for a long time, as Nick did. I have many friends in the PLA and so forth, and we cannot have a purely antagonistic relationship. I agree with Nick. I mean, it has not turned out the way we'd hoped 20 years ago. The Chinese evolution has not gone the way that we hoped, starting with Deng Xiaoping, and we thought there would be more kind of convergence
WTO under President the
of
Clinton administration.
values, and it hasn't happened, and we have to be wide awake to that fact. The wishes we all had in the 90s for the China of the future have not eventuated. But we have to pick ourselves up and go on, and that means you do have to have some modus vivendi with them, because we do share the world's economy, and we share the world's ecosystem, and you know, war, and even Cold War, is a pretty dark future. And, you know, even that my job was to prepare for those. You can't say that's your first choice, and there's nothing inevitable about that. So I think and I didn't hear what Joe said, but just from your recounting of it, it sounds sensible, and we may get much more value out of that. It's a little hard to see that with Vladimir Putin, because I always say his objective is purely to frustrate us. Imagine trying to build a bridge to that motivation. It's a little hard.
So I think we have time for, I'm looking to Jonathan, 5 minutes. Maybe we'll get 2 questions in. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Justin Doubleday, reporter with Inside Defense. Secretary Carter, just as the man who wrote the last Pentagon artificial intelligence policy for the use of AI, obviously there's a lot of debate around what the next set of policies will be. What has changed since you wrote that last policy, and what sort of considerations do you think need to be taken into account as we set some new barriers?
Yeah, for those of you who don't know, this is one thing I wrote actually as the deputy secretary in 2013, and when no one was paying any attention to AI, but we were. And what it says, I think, is still basically right. You can elaborate on it, but I think it's basically right. And it's actually a lesson for AI in general, I think, in its deployment in society. What I said was that, as always, we take our values to the battlefield as a nation. I make no apologies about that. None of us ever made any apologies about that. And in the matter of AI, that there would not be an autonomous use of lethal force, literally autonomous. There would always be a human being involved in the decision to use lethal force on behalf of the United States. That's not the same as man in the loop, I should say, by the way. It's not like somebody inside the computer trying to keep up with the computer. It is a ethical and accountable decision. And the reason I said that was I imagined myself, or the secretary that I was working for, the morning after something had happened, like an airstrike which had gone wrong, and people who were not part of the intended targets were injured. And I imagined myself going before the press and saying, the machine did it. I'd be crucified. And I should be. You aren't going to take that as a, and by the way, the same thing is true, Nick, for a self-driving car that runs over somebody. The judge is going to want to know whether somebody is responsible for this. Now, that doesn't mean somebody has to be blamed over everything, because there is something called having made a mistake. And judges accept that. We all accept that. But there has to be, in order for these to be deployed in a way that makes consequential decisions that affect people, there has to be enough transparency and enough accountability in these systems that can be built in. And I said that will be a design criterion for us in the department. By the way, I think it's ought to be a design criterion in AI everywhere. And I have to say it has to be a design criterion because it's not automatic. You can build, and there are some of the extant AI algorithms which are very difficult to retrace the path of decision. So it is something engineers have to build in, but that's what I do for, that's my life is running engineering programs and technology programs, and that's something that will be done if it is said. So that's what it says, and again, we can elaborate, but I think it's basically the right thing, and it's whatever, how many years later, 6 years later, it still sounds right to me.
Ash, I want to give you the last word. We're going to have to close this session. I want to ask you about something we really haven't talked a lot about today, and that is, where's the leadership going to come from? These are big challenges that we've talked about today. How do you compete with China and yet and not be dominated, but work with them? How do we maintain the military superiority of our technological base? I interviewed our friend, Secretary Condoleezza Rice, at Aspen a year and a half ago, summer of 2017. She's our co-chair for the Aspen Strategy Group. And I remember saying something like, what do you worry? It's a public session. What do you worry about the most? I thought she'd say Iran, North Korea, Putin, China. She said, we've lost our self-confidence. I interviewed Federica Mogherini, who is in effect the EU foreign minister, at the Kennedy School where we work last month. I said, Mrs. Mogherini, you've got a lot on your plate, Iran and Russia and China. And what are you worried about? She said, we Europeans have lost our self-confidence. I took these two statements from these senior women, world leaders, to be that we don't really have someone in Western leadership, maybe with the exception of Angela Merkel right now, who is saying that the democratic way, as opposed to the authoritarian way, MBS, Erdogan, the Chinese, the Russians, our democratic way is the way forward. And I think what you just intimated, that you've got confidence that the United States, that the tech community, our universities can actually meet the test of this technological revolution. Is self-confidence part of our problem? Is leadership part of our problem?
It is, and I'm not pessimistic at all. I think we do have the best system in the world. I think our values are, there are things I believe in. I want my children to live up in a world like that, and most of the world wants to live that way, no matter what the leaders you just enumerated think. So in that sense, we're playing a winning moral hand, and that still matters in this world, despite all the craziness of the leaders like the ones you named, and all the rip-roaring technological change that goes on, and so forth. It will take, and I wasn't present for this earlier, but from what I infer of what you talked about earlier about this cooperation between, I think you talked about the cooperation between the world of business, the world of government, the world of thought and ideas, and I think it does take that coming together. But a lot of the issues I was talking about earlier about the biotech revolution, genomics, AI, social media and so forth, these are puzzling to people, but they haven't taken on the political toxicity of other settled issues. There's no sort of partisan rancor. People are bewildered by them. They haven't figured out how to line up anywhere. And that is the one hopeful thing in this technological picture, to me, is if we can make doing something sensible available in front and center, I think people may come together behind it. And that's true for leadership in the world as well. I think there's a latent demand for it. So, maybe I'm Pollyannish, but I'm not pessimistic. Nick, and I don't think you are by nature either. Bless you for it. So I hope people in this room aren't either.
I think we were in danger of depressing this group earlier with the big threats. It's nice to leave on hope that we Americans have faith in ourselves and faith in our society. Ash, thank you.
Thank you, Nick.
Thank you very much. And thank you to all for being with us. Thank you very much.